Welcome everybody to our text study that's going to be a slow crawl toward Christmas. We're beginning here in September. We're going to walk through the very first half of the second chapter of Luke's Gospel, and we're going to take it little bit by little bit. So we'll be posting this video every Monday, Lord willing, and if you would like to watch it just on your own time, you're free to do that. If you'd like to be informed of when the video is up and get the handouts for our Wednesday discussion, whether you plan to attend or not, then just write us here at info@stmarkpresbyterian.org. If you have any questions at all, do that. Write that address and we'll respond to you. So every Wednesday following the video, we'll have an in-person discussion here at St. Mark, and we understand not everybody can be here physically, so it will be on Zoom, and we understand that not everybody's available at that time, so we'll capture that, we'll record it, and we'll put that up on our website, our church website, as well as our YouTube channel. And again, if you have any questions, you write info@stmarkpresbyterian.org, and we'll get back to you about that. So between now and Christmas Eve, more or less, we're going to be breaking down the first chapter of Luke and the beginnings of the second chapter. That part you're very familiar with as the Christmas story. And this is how we'll do it week by week. Now you may not be able to see all of this, so in the handout that I'm sending out, I've got all of these scriptures listed with the dates. And what you would be able to see is this. Here's what we're doing in the month of September. So you can see that today we're just doing verses 1 through 4, and then we'll take just a little bit by little bit each time. I've tried to break it up to where it won't be tedious, but we can give it the attention that it needs. And I'm sure I'm going to miss the mark every now and then, so just hang in there with me. And again, any questions, any concerns, any comments, as you can see, if you've seen this before, you know I'm in a new location. I'm trying to do this without having to occupy myself with a speaker and a microphone and all those kinds of things, trying to simplify my process. And so if you would like to respond to us with regard to how well you can hear, how well you can see, and all of that, I'm always ready to tweak the process and to fix it as we go along. I'm the only one in the room, so some of it's going to be a little rough, and I would invite you to hang with me. So the question we're going to look at today, as we look at Luke chapter 1, verses 1 through 4, is the question, what is Luke's theology of Scripture? Luke is very different than the other Gospels in that there's almost a salutation at the beginning of Luke. There's a similar one at the beginning of Acts. And Luke actually, in these first 4 verses, talks about the reason for which he wrote the Gospel and the process that he followed in writing the Gospel. Not something you get in any of the other Gospels. So it's very interesting, and it gives us a glimpse at Luke's theology of Scripture. Now, this phrase, theology of Scripture, I don't know if it's a working phrase in the real world, but what I mean by that is, how is God involved in the process of scripturing? How is God involved in that process? So what we're going to look at today is Luke's theology of Scripture. And what we'll look at on Wednesday in our discussion is, what is your theology of Scripture? So, as you begin to join me today in studying Luke's theology of Scripture and begin to think about your own perspective on the role of God in the scripturing process, let me give you 2 things to think about. Sometimes our theology of Scripture is presented that the Scriptures are the inspired writings of a religious people. That's one popular way of thinking about it. Another way that's a little bit different is that the Scriptures are the religious writings of an inspired people. And you can see that that puts the gift of inspiration not so much on the words on the page, but on the people writing. And that makes quite a difference. So I would just invite you to think about these two phrases. And when we gather on Wednesday, if you're able to join us, just have a sense of whether one of these two names your own theology of Scripture better or not. We'll look on Wednesday at some very popular ways that people express their theology of Scripture. But for now, we're just going to think in terms of these two phrases. Which one captures your heart a little better? That's what we'll bring into the discussion on Wednesday. But we're not ready to talk about our theology of Scripture until we look at what the Scriptures say about themselves. And Luke chapter 1, verses 1 through 4, gives us as close of a view of a gospel writer's self-understanding as any other spot we get in the Scriptures. So, without any further ado, let's get on with the text here. Reading from Luke chapter 1. This is how the entire Gospel of Luke begins. And let me just warn you, verses 1 through 4 is one long sentence. So here we go. Since many have undertaken to set down an orderly account of the events that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed on to us by those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and servants of the word, I too decided, after investigating everything carefully from the very first, to write an orderly account for you, O most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the truth concerning the things about which you have been instructed. This ends the one long sentence that begins Luke's gospel. So, let's take it verse by verse. Here's verse 1. Since many have undertaken to set down an orderly account of the events that have been fulfilled among us. So that's a dependent clause, and it says some pretty interesting things. I mean, first of all, did you know, before you read this, now we know, that many people had undertaken to write about the life of Jesus. Many people. Now we know of 4 Gospels, maybe a 5th, the Gospel of Thomas. We know that there was a process along the way where the early church decided which of the scriptural writings, whether it's letters from Paul or from others, or Gospels, which ones belong in what we call the New Testament, the canon, the measuring rod for faith. And but Luke gives us a glimpse that there are a lot of people doing this. Many have undertaken to write about the life of Jesus. So, one question we're going to wonder is Luke, is he thinking about Matthew and Mark? We're fairly sure that to this point the Gospel of John had not been written. But Matthew and Mark possibly have. Most biblical scholars feel like Mark was written first, and that Matthew and Luke both had a pretty extant copy of Mark on hand, which they used because they follow the sequence of Mark very, very closely. But they also had some other resources as well. There's that document that we call the Q document, only because we don't know where it is, who wrote it, or anything. But it does seem to be another resource that Matthew and Luke had in common, which is not present in Mark. So is Luke thinking of the other gospel writers, or this Q document, as it were? Or are there really, really many people writing all kinds of stuff about Jesus, some of which may be reliable, some of which may not? That's a good question. All we know at this point is a lot of people are writing about the life of Jesus. Writing about the life of Jesus, okay? And I'm emphasizing writing because there's an oral tradition in play. We'll see reference to that in a moment. But at some point, someone's taking that oral tradition and putting it on paper. And that That's not the way it was always done. For many years, people only had the oral traditions. And then when they were settling societies, they had some leisure, and during that leisure time, people developed ways of writing and recording history and writing stories and so forth, to where the oral tradition became a written tradition. And so people are doing that here. That's a way that you ensure that the story stays standardized and that it gets handed down from generation to generation. And by the time of the first century, the Jews were very much a written tradition people. So it would not be odd that followers of Jesus, most of whom the early followers were Jewish Christians, are really accustomed to writing down their accounts of their faith. People are doing that. And many have undertaken the task of writing down an orderly account. It's kind of interesting that the phrase, the Greek word translated orderly account, is diegesis. And it could be just narrative. People have written a narrative. That's a very legitimate translation. But what's interesting is that biblical scholars will tell you that what we do with a written text is exegesis. That is, we're interpreting out of the text meaning. Diegesis means interpreting with the text meaning. So you've got a two-sided process where people are taking their oral tradition and their knowledge of the events that have taken place among us, as Luke puts it, and they're writing that into the text. They're inscribing that. And then we, as faithful readers, take that inscription and derive from it meaning and purpose. So you take a life, put it into text, you take a text, and understand a life. That's the diegesis and exegesis. Exe means out, dia means alongside. So it's kind of an interesting interplay of terms there. Many people are taking the life of Jesus and inscribing it. And I'm saying the life of Jesus. Luke is a little more vague at this point, but seems to be implying that the person to whom he is writing know what he's talking about, because he talks about the events that have been fulfilled among us. To describe the life, death, resurrection of Jesus as events that have been fulfilled among us could be just kind of a colloquial way of saying things that have happened. But it could also mean that these things are fulfilling something. And maybe that's why Luke and some of the other gospel writers will often quote Old Testament scriptures to say that this didn't just come out of nowhere. This is a fulfillment of what had been promised before. It's interesting that Luke would refer to it that way. He doesn't say the life of Jesus. He's talking about the events that have been fulfilled among us. Verse 2. So we got that dependent clause, and it continues. Just as they were handed on to us by those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. This is a great verse. It's just chock full of meaning. First of all, we see that before the written tradition, you have an oral tradition. So Luke is not an eyewitness to the life of Jesus. He's not following Jesus around and writing things down as they happen. His quotes don't come from hearing it himself. He's a recipient of the message from others, just like you're a recipient from the message from others. Very early on, Luke is acknowledging that this is the message that's been handed on to him. He is not an eyewitness, right? But there are those who were eyewitnesses. So we're still early enough, perhaps, in the process. You could use this phrase if an eyewitness told the story to somebody, who then told the story to somebody, who then told the story to you, and you didn't hear it directly from the eyewitness's mouth, but you heard the story that the eyewitness told. That's how the oral tradition works. And sometimes in an oral tradition, things change. People get better. Heroic people get better than they were, and nasty people get worse than they were. And people remember things differently, and they use different language and so forth. But what Luke is telling us is that prior to his writing the gospel, he is receiving an oral tradition, and that means people are involved. People are telling these stories. And he describes them as eyewitnesses and servants of the word. This is an interesting term. First of all, Friedrich Schleiermacher uses this term in a collection of sermons that he published back in the 18th century. And I don't know if he chose it or his publisher, but servant of the word is how many of us who preach feel like our call is to be servants of the word. It's not the typical word for servant, which is doulos. It's not another typical word for servant, which is diakonos, deacon. It's a different word that kind of means an under-rower, a helper, a supplier. And it shows up again in Luke's gospel. It's interesting. In Luke chapter 4, Jesus goes to his hometown of Nazareth and he reads from the prophet Isaiah, and then he puts the scroll back and all of that. Well, if you read that closely, he's given the scroll of the prophet Isaiah, and when he's done, he hands it back to the attendant. That's the person whose job is to select the scrolls, give it, take it back, file it correctly, keep them safe. These are precious and fragile documents. And it's called attendant in most translations in Luke chapter 4. It's the same word. These were attendants of the word. They were taking the word and sharing it, and then keeping it, preserving it. So one thing I'm going to invite you to look for as we read through this first chapter and part of chapter 2 is, are there people in the story who seem to be attendants of the word, preserving it and keeping it? It's going to be an interesting discovery if you keep that question in mind. So, Luke said many people have been undertaking the task of writing about the events that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who were eyewitnesses and attendants of the word. Now, he says, I too decided, after investigating everything carefully from the very first, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus. There's a lot here as well, isn't there? First of all, I too decided means that Luke is deciding something here. He's making a decision. This is a willful choice on his part. He's not been grabbed by the Spirit of God and whipped off to some place and told, write these words and eat them, or anything like that. That does happen in some of the prophetic stories. Luke is making a decision here. So there's human agency involved in the very process of deciding to write. So now we get a glimpse a little bit about the human agency involved in what's going on, beyond just the oral tradition that's been passed down, one would assume, faithfully. But Luke is owning it here. I decided, after investigating everything carefully. So, you don't get the impression that Luke heard a divine voice saying, pick up thy quill and begin to write, and then was just taking dictation from God. There's not only the agency of decision making, there's the activity of investigating. So what this would tell us, though, is that not all of these stories, whether orally or the stories that many have undertaken to write, necessarily are reliable. One has to study the matter in order to present an orderly account. So this orderly account, it really, the word kind of implies sequence, telling things in the right order, which makes us pause and think that if Luke is correcting some crazy off the path account of Jesus' life that somebody wrote, full of passion perhaps, but just got everything wrong. If he's correcting them, we don't really have access to that, but it would make sense that Luke is just trying to give it in the right order. But also remember, there's something unique about Luke's gospel, and that's his Christmas story. It's nowhere in the Gospel of Mark. It won't appear later in the Gospel of John, and Matthew doesn't really have the same Christmas story. Matthew tells us about the Magi, but not the shepherds. So maybe one thing Luke is saying here is could be trying to explain why his presentation of the gospel would be different from what one might read in Mark or Matthew if he has the sense that the people to whom he's writing have access to those texts. Does that make sense? So what we really don't know is Luke investigating because some of the accounts out there are untrustworthy, or is Luke investigating because trustworthy accounts like Matthew and Mark don't quite have it all in the right order or the full story. It's really hard to say, and it's so hard for us to go back behind the text and to see what exactly was the relationship between Matthew, Mark, and Luke, these synoptic gospels, so-called because they tend to be telling the same story in pretty much the same order. We just don't know, but we know that Luke is concerned about something and writing this account to set the record straight in some ways. Okay, and he also directs it to most excellent Theophilus. What we don't know is whether this is really a person or not. The word Theophilus is made up of two Greek words, theos, for God, and phileo, which means either friend or lover. Like the word Philadelphia is phileo, and Adelphos, the city of brotherly love. So there could be a person named Theophilus to whom Luke is writing this account. The book of Acts is dedicated to the same person. Or it could be anyone who's a lover of God. That's you. That's me. Maybe this is written generally for those of us who love God. It's kind of hard to say. Okay, and now the last verse. Luke has investigated thoroughly, writing this orderly account so that you may know the truth concerning things about which you have been instructed. Again, a mouthful here. First of all, that you may know the truth. Somebody needs to set the record straight. There are some less than truthful, perhaps even untruthful accounts out there. And Luke has that in view. Again, is he looking at Matthew and Mark, or is he looking at some of the writings about Jesus that were considered so unreliable, history didn't even bother retaining them? I don't know. All we know is that Luke has something in mind, and he's trying to correct it so that Theophilus, the lover of God, can know the truth. About what? About the things about which you have been instructed. So now we know that Theophilus, whether that's an actual individual or just a general person who loves God, to whom Luke is addressing this gospel, now we know that they have been part of an oral tradition. They have received instruction. This phrase, the things about which you have been instructed, it's an interesting Greek phrase. Luke, by the way, is an excellent Greek writer. His Greek is very sophisticated, much more sophisticated than Mark's, way more sophisticated than the book of Revelation. So he seems to be a highly educated Greek, in the Greek language person. And this is the great phrase, the things The word there is actually logos. It's the plural form of logos, which you may know means the word. And so it could be the words about which you have been instructed. But the word really points to more than just a phonetic sound. It points to the reality behind the sound. So it's not an untrustworthy thing to translate logos in the plural as things, as opposed to simply words. A strict literal interpretation would probably have words about what you have been instructed. And the phrase instructed, it looks to me, I haven't been able to do much of a study of it, but it's the word catechesis. So from which we get the word catechism, which would be an oral teaching instruction. That's what catechisms are. And so what we're getting is a little glimpse into the world of the early church prior to the writing of the gospel. We would assume by this point that the writings of Paul have been sent to various churches and rotated around as public letters. We don't know if Theophilus is in one of those circles to where he would have read any of those letters of Paul, or if Theophilus just means friends of God. Some people will, some people wouldn't. Others have heard the oral instruction, and they've been trained. And Luke is trying to make sure that the training is done well by investigating everything thoroughly and setting down an accurate, orderly account. So that brings us to the question, what is Luke's theology of Scripture? Where is God in this process? What Luke does not give us is, here's how I understand Scripture, la da 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 da. We don't get that from Luke. But we do have this interesting introduction to a gospel which tells about the birth and the life and the ministry and the teachings and the suffering and the death and the resurrection and the disciples of Jesus. We have a very deliberate account, a very long gospel relative to Mark, full of details, some of which are very unique to Luke. Does Luke see himself as one taking dictation? Does Luke see himself as someone caught in a moment where you have to tell the story almost as a corrective argument over and against mistelling? What is Luke's theology of Scripture? We're never going to be able to get into his head, but we do have these first 4 verses. So with that in mind, again, I'm going to invite you to start thinking about what is your theology of Scripture. That will be our conversation piece on Wednesday after we review this text. Is it the inspired writings of religious people? Could you say it's the religious writings of inspired people? Or do you have simply another way of interpreting it yourself? So on Wednesday, the question is, what is your theology of Scripture? And we'll hope that at least our investigation of that question will be informed by what we hear Luke say about his theology of Scripture in these first 4 verses. All right? That's all we're going to have time for today. So again, info at stmarkpresbyterian.org. Don't be shy about reaching out if you have any questions, complaints, suggestions, or what have you. And other than that, for those of you who can be in the room on Wednesday at 9:30 a.m. Pacific time, I look forward to seeing you. For those of you who can join us by Zoom, we'll be there for you. And if you would like to circle back and see that after we've captured and posted it on our website, then thank you for that. Thank you all for being here. Bye.